Let me tell you how this story ends before I tell you how it began, because I think you need to know what you are staying for before I take you back to the hardest part. 2 years after my husband stood in his mother's living room and told his entire family that I was the reason we could not get ahead financially, that my spending and my ambition and my refusal to be practical were the source of every difficulty we had ever faced as a couple. I bought a house, not a modest starter home purchased just to prove a point, a real house in a good neighborhood with a yard and a mortgage I qualified for entirely on my own income without a single dollar of his contribution. His mother drove past it once. I was told later by someone who was there and said nothing, just looked at it from the car window and said nothing. I do not tell you that to be cruel. I tell you that because it is the most honest ending I know how to give this story, and because I think you deserve the honest version rather than the tidy one. But before the house, there was the living room, and before the living room, there were 7 years. And before I can tell you what those 7 years cost me, I need to tell you what I brought into them, so you understand exactly what was being spent without my permission while I was not looking. I was 26 when I married David. I was working in finance, early in my career but moving fast, the kind of fast that comes from genuine aptitude, combined with a willingness to work harder than the people around you. I was not rich. I was not even comfortable in the way that word usually means, but I was building something and I knew it, and the knowledge of it was its own kind of currency. The confidence of someone who understands that the current chapter is not the whole story. David was charming and funny and certain in a way that I found compelling at 20. Sixth, in a way, I would not find compelling now. He had opinions about everything and delivered them with a conviction that I mistook for knowledge. He made me feel, in those early years, like the future was a place we were building together with equal hands. That was the first thing that turned out not to be true. But I did not know that yet. I was 26 and in love, and the living room was still 7 years away. The financial dynamic between David and me shifted so gradually that I did not see it happening until the shift was already complete. That is the thing about gradual changes inside a marriage. They do not announce themselves. They accumulate in the background while you're busy with the ordinary work of a shared life. And by the time you look up and take stock of what has actually changed, the new reality has been in place long enough that it has started to feel like the original one. In the early years of our marriage, we both worked and both contributed and both operated as equal partners in the financial decisions of our household. That was real, at least at the beginning. David had a good job in sales and made decent money and took genuine pride in his contribution. But sales is a volatile income, and David's relationship with volatility was not good. He needed stability in a way he had never fully acknowledged to either of us. And when the numbers fluctuated, as they do in sales, he responded with an anxiety that looked from the outside a lot like blame. The first time he suggested that my spending was a problem, I was genuinely confused. I had not changed my spending. I was, if anything, more careful than I had been before we married because I took our shared financial future seriously. But I was also by that point earning more than him, not dramatically more, not in a way that should have meant anything about the balance of power between us, but enough that the gap was visible, and enough that David had noticed it, and enough that the noticing had done something to the story he told himself about who he was in this marriage. I understand now what was happening. I did not understand it then because I was inside it, and because understanding it would have required me to name something that David was working very hard not to have named. His income was inconsistent. Mine was growing. He needed an explanation for that difference that did not locate the cause in him. I was the most convenient alternative explanation available. My spending, my choices, My ambition, which he had begun to describe as impractical, in a tone that made it sound like a character flaw rather than an asset, I started to believe him, not all at once and not without resistance, but slowly, in the way that water finds its way into things, through the small cracks of my own insecurity and his consistent pressure, until the belief was in there deep enough to affect my behavior. I started second-guessing purchases I had never thought twice about. I started consulting him on financial decisions that were mine to make. I started apologizing for earning money, which is a sentence I could not have imagined writing 5 years earlier, and which I now understand as one of the clearest signs of how thoroughly I had been reshaped by 7 years of living inside someone else's narrative about who I was. The night in his mother's living room happened in October, 3 months before I finally left. I want to describe it carefully because the details matter and because I think vague descriptions of painful moments do a disservice to anyone who has lived through something similar and needs to know that their specific experience is real and nameable. We were at a family dinner, the kind that happened monthly at his mother Patricia's house, with his 2 brothers and their wives, and Patricia herself presiding over the table in the way she had always presided, with a warmth that was real and a sharpness underneath it that was equally real and not always distinguishable from the warmth until it was too late to protect yourself from it. David had been in a difficult month. 2 deals had fallen through, and his commission check had been significantly smaller than projected, and the anxiety that lived in him had been louder than usual in the weeks leading up to that dinner. I had noticed it, and I had been careful in the way I had learned to be careful, which is to say, I had been managing the atmosphere of our home the way you manage weather, constantly checking the conditions and adjusting my behavior accordingly to avoid the particular kind of storm that his unacknowledged anxiety could produce when it had been building long enough. I was tired. That is the honest truth of where I was that October. Tired in a way that had stopped being about sleep and had become something more structural. The exhaustion of someone who has been holding something heavy for so long that they have forgotten what it felt like to put it down. The conversation at dinner shifted, the way conversations at family dinners sometimes do, toward money, toward the economy, toward the difficulty of the current moment, toward the particular pressures facing people in sales. David started talking. I watched it happen from across the table and understood what was coming before it arrived. The way you understand weather from the particular quality of the light. He talked about our financial situation in terms that located every difficulty outside himself, the market, the timing, the choices that had been made at the household level that had made it harder to build real stability. He did not say my name. He did not have to. Patricia looked at me once, briefly, and then looked back at her son, and in that glance was the entire verdict. I sat at that table, and I listened to my husband tell his family a version of our financial life in which I was the problem. And I said nothing, and I drove home in silence. And I lay in bed that night next to someone who fell asleep quickly, and Isley and I stared at the ceiling and made a decision that I had been approaching for a long time and had not been willing to make until that moment. I moved out 3 months later. I want to tell you that the decision to leave was clean and clear and arrived with certainty. But the truth is that it was none of those things. It was the hardest decision I had made in my adult life up to that point, which surprises people when I tell them, given everything I've just described. But that is the thing about leaving a marriage that has cost you something real. The cost does not make the leaving easier. In some ways, it makes it harder because you have invested so much that the idea of walking away from the investment feels like compounding the loss. I had spent 7 years in that relationship, 7 years of work and compromise and hope, and the daily labor of trying to build something with someone who was. I had finally allowed myself to understand, not building with me, but constructing a story in which my contributions were liabilities and my growth was a threat. Leaving meant admitting that those 7 years had not produced what I had believed I was building. That is a grief that does not have a clean name and does not resolve quickly. Regardless of how justified the leaving is, I grieved it honestly. I gave myself permission to grieve it without also having to immediately reframe it as a lesson or a gift or a necessary step towards something better. Because sometimes things are just losses before they become anything else, and rushing them toward meaning before you have actually felt them is its own kind of avoidance. I stayed with a friend for the first month. I found an apartment at the end of month 2, modest and mine, with no one else's anxiety in the walls and no weather to manage and no version of myself I needed to perform. I sat in it the first night surrounded by boxes and takeout containers, and I felt something I had not felt in so long that it took me a moment to identify it. Quiet, not the tense quiet of a house where someone's mood is determining the atmosphere, just quiet. The ordinary neutral quiet of a space that belonged entirely to me. I cried that night for a long time, and then I slept better than I had slept in years. And in the morning I made coffee and sat by the window and looked at the street below and thought, very simply and without drama, now what? The now what turned out to be everything, but I did not know that yet. I just knew I was starting from somewhere real for the first time in a long time. And that starting from somewhere real, even when somewhere real is a modest apartment with boxes on the floor and a future that has not yet declared its shape, is worth more than continuing from somewhere false? No matter how comfortable the furniture. The first year after I left was the year I stopped apologizing for being good at my job. I want to be specific about that because I think the specificity matters. I had spent the last several years of my marriage subtly, and then not so subtly dimming my professional ambitions in response to David's discomfort with them, not making the ask for the promotion I had earned, not putting my name forward for the projects that would have accelerated my trajectory, making myself professionally smaller in the same way I had made myself personally smaller as a management strategy for someone else's insecurity. In the first year after I left, all of that stopped. I made the ask, I put my name forward. I stopped managing upward with apology and started managing upward with evidence, which is what I had been doing before. David's voice had gotten into my professional confidence and made me uncertain about whether I had the right to take up space in rooms where I was clearly qualified to be. The promotion came through 6 months after I moved into the apartment, the one I had been eligible for and had not pursued for 2 years. I sat in my manager's office and received the news and thanked her and walked back to my desk and sent a message to my best friend that said it happened. She called me immediately, and I stepped outside and stood on the pavement outside the office building, and she said things that I needed to hear, and I let myself feel the full weight of it, rather than immediately minimizing it the way I had learned to minimize good news about myself in the years when good news about me was an inconvenience to someone I lived with. I took myself to dinner that night, alone, at a restaurant I had always wanted to try, with a book and a glass of wine and no one whose mood I needed to monitor. They ordered exactly what I wanted. I sat there for 2 hours. I was happy in a way that was entirely self-generated and entirely mine and entirely uncontingent on anyone else's response to it. That dinner was one of the most significant meals of my life, and I ate it alone, and it was perfect. The house happened in the second year. I want to tell you how it came about practically before I tell you what it meant, because I think the practical version is actually more useful than the symbolic one. I had been saving with focus and intention since the month. I moved into the apartment, not aggressively or at the expense of living my life, but with the steady, consistent discipline of someone who has a specific goal and has decided to take it seriously. I worked with a financial advisor, something I had always wanted to do and had never done because David had opinions about financial advisors that were largely based on not wanting anyone with professional credentials to examine our finances too closely. The advisor was direct and practical and treated me like someone capable of making intelligent decisions about my own money, which sounds like the minimum standard of professional respect, and which I realized sitting in her office for the first time. I had not been receiving for years. We made a plan. I followed it. I made additional income through projects I took on outside my main role, work that used skills I had been underutilizing during the years when professional ambition had been a source of friction rather than something to be cultivated and celebrated. By month 18, I had a down payment. By month 20, I had found the house. By month 22, I had closed on it. I want to describe the day I got the keys because I think it deserves to be described properly. It was a Thursday morning in spring. The agent handed me the keys in the driveway and shook my hand and said, "Congratulations," and got in her car and drove away, and I stood in the driveway alone, holding the keys to a house that was mine, purchased with money I had earned and saved without anyone's permission or contribution or validation. I did not cry immediately. I stood there for a while first, just holding the keys, letting the reality of what had just happened settle into my body at whatever pace it needed to settle, and then I went inside. I walked through every room slowly. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I stood in the backyard and looked at the yard and thought about the October dinner and the living room and Patricia's glance and David's voice, describing our difficulties in terms that left me as the cause of all of them. And then I took out my phone and I called my mother and I said, "I just got the keys." She said, "To what?" I said, "To my house." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Your house." I said, "Yes." She cried. I cried. We stayed on the phone for a long time without saying, very much because sometimes the most important things do not need language to be fully communicated between people who love each other and have been waiting together for the right moment to arrive. Here's what I want you to take from this story, and I want to be direct about it because I think directness is more useful than eloquence. When the thing you are trying to say is genuinely important, there are people in this world who will look at your growth and experience it as a threat, who will respond to your expanding capacity not with celebration, but with a need to contain it, to explain it away, to locate your strengths as problems in the narrative they need to tell about themselves. These people are not always villains. David was not a villain. He was a person with unacknowledged insecurities and insufficient courage to examine them honestly. And those two things together produced a dynamic that cost me years and cost me something harder to quantify than years. The version of myself I would have been if I had not spent that time shrinking to fit a space that was never the right size for me. I do not hate him. I am not interested in his suffering, and I am not interested in his success. I am interested in the time I lost and in not losing any more of it, which is the only productive relationship I know how to have with the past. What I want you to understand is this. If someone in your life responds to your growth with anxiety rather than pride, that is information. If someone consistently locates your ambition as a problem rather than an asset, that is information. If you find yourself making yourself smaller, professionally or personally, as a management strategy for someone else's insecurity, that is information too. You are not obligated to act on that information immediately. Leaving is hard and grief is real, and the investment of years creates a weight that is not easily put down. But you are obligated to be honest with yourself about what the information means. The version of you that earns more and wants more and builds more is not the problem in your relationship. It is the solution to your life. And if the relationship cannot accommodate the solution, then the relationship is the thing that needs to change, not you. I stood in the backyard of my house on a Thursday morning in spring, and I looked at something I had built entirely by myself, and I understood, with a clarity that arrived quietly rather than dramatically, that the years I had spent making myself smaller had not been wasted. They had been the education I needed to understand exactly how large I was actually capable of becoming. The living room happened. The glance happened. The words happened. And then this happened. And this, I can tell you with complete certainty, was always the truer story. It was just waiting for me to stop agreeing with the false one long enough to let it arrive.